Hello, hello, hello. My name is Justin Coletti, and welcome to MixCon. Thanks for coming out. This is now our 4th annual MixCon. When we started it in a room that would fit a small portion of how many we can fit here today. And it's just great to see it kind of grow every year. Now we've got 6 main stage presentations this year. There's still 2 more coming up. You guys are here for our next guy, David Tolomei, who I'll introduce in just a minute. Before I introduce our next presenter, though, I want to give a big shout out to the guys who make this possible. The reason this is free to attend, free on video afterwards. You can listen to this in your own studio environment, on your studio monitors, on your favorite pair of headphones at home. The reason you can do that for free, come here for free, is because of our sponsors. And this particular presentation has a sponsor that's a really great fit for David because he loves their stuff. I love their stuff. I've been using their stuff for years. And that sponsor is Sound Toys. Can we give a big round of applause for Sound Toys for helping us do this for free? Now I'd like to finally introduce our next presenter, David Tolomei. I had so much fun talking to David on the phone before he got here. I really want to get him on stage because I think he has tremendous insights into what really matters when you're mixing and how to mix creatively and create really distinctive sounds. And obviously, there's not a formula for creating really distinctive and original sounds, but there is a kind of a philosophy that you can adapt. There's a kind of thought process you can adopt that can help you mix more creatively, more distinctively, and David's going to tell us all about that. David has worked with some of the most distinctive and interesting and critically acclaimed artists in recent history. He's worked with Beach House, Dirty Projectors, Future Islands. Most recently, he's got a record coming out with this band called Waif. Actually, it's out right now. They're on the cover of this issue of the Delhi magazine, which you can get here at MixCon. And we're going to get to go under the hood of a real track from that commercial release from Waif. Can we get a round of applause for Waif for letting us do that? I'm so psyched. I mean, so many of the bands he worked with have made some of my favorite sounds of the past 10 years or so. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome up to the stage, big round of applause, Mr. David Tolomei, please.
Hi.
Right, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Justin. And thanks to everybody for coming as well. What I'd like to start out with is just a little bit of a disclaimer. And that's that when it comes to music, I think it's really important to consider that there aren't really any real rules. There are things that seem like rules, but they're really just actions and results. So there are going to be a lot of things I say up here today that may sound like I'm confidently saying, like, this is how you do this is how you do that. But really, I'm just trying to give examples of my own workflow and the things that work for me in order for me to reach my desired result. And so if you were to go try one of these things and it didn't work for you, you can just kind of look beyond what the actual action was, and I'll get more into that kind of thing now. So, what is my desired result? What am I going for when I start a mix? I kind of have a different answer for this question depending on what the record is, which I guess makes life interesting. It's always new challenges. But there are some common threads. First and foremost, emotion is really important to me in music. I really want to be emotionally impacted by a song, both while I'm working on it and also when I listen to it as a listener. And so it's kind of my highest priority to find a way to emotionally connect with a song before I start working on it and while I'm working on it, and try and kind of put myself where the artist was when they wrote the song, performed the song, and kind of imagine the experiences they may have had that inspired the song. And this might sound kind of dramatic, but just for me personally, it's part of the process, and I think subconsciously it becomes a big part of the decisions I make when I'm working on an album. A second thing that's kind of a thread in my what I'm going for, much less esoteric thing, is I want to be able to hear everything. And that's just, probably something basic with, anybody mixing is going to say, like finding clarity in a mix is like one of your major roles. But I'm always at least attempting to take that to the next level. Like, I want there to be more detail than as if I was actually there. I want to feel the textures. I want the hairs on my back to stand up. I want just extreme detail within reason. And what I mean by that is there are definitely situations where you try and bring out detail and it doesn't work with the composition for that particular part of the instrumentation. So you do have to use some judgment there. Another great example would be if the way a song was produced, there's a lot of instruments that have a lot of material in a specific frequency range. Like let's say there's a ton of instruments with all things happening at 5K. You can't bring out the detail in all those things, or you kind of end up with this big mess that just makes people want to turn the music down. Let's see, the third big thread for me is contrast. And this is a really major one for me that, again, it may be common with other guys as well, but it's not something that I hear talked about a lot. A great example would be like if you have a bunch of distorted sounds in a mix, which is really common these days. Working in the digital domain, a lot of files you get a lot of times have a lot of pre-processing and are have quite a bit of distortion on them. But if absolutely everything is somehow saturated, then there's no contrast and nothing sounds saturated. But if you have, a bunch of really distorted things and then you lay them on top of, like a really glassy, pristine sample, then that distortion is really going to stand out, but it's also going to make that pristine sample seem even more pristine. And so that's something I try and use to my advantage regularly. It can be kind of difficult making those judgment calls depending on how well you know the artist, because you don't necessarily want to slam a distortion on something that they didn't want it on. So that's something you have to kind of be careful with in the beginning, and you develop kind of an instinct of okay, obviously they're not going to mind this snare being a little dirtier or this bass. And then you get a little bit more confident about maybe this background vocal that's really tucked in and panned, they might not even notice it, or they might notice it and love it. And then the last thing that's kind of a common thread when I'm mixing is little creative nuggets that I'll throw in, and this is only when there's time. This would be reverb throws, delay throws, kind of non-standard automation to support the arrangement. And it's really important that these things come out really subtle, and there's a really thin line between cheese and non-cheese when it comes to things like delay throws. And I think there's a lot of examples of it, kind of in the 90s and 2000s when, automation technology was really progressing and some people kind of went a little bit overboard with it. And so it's something that I try and be aware of, but I do feel like it can kind of take a lot of mixes that last step. And when I run through the song, there will be some good examples of that as well. Another reason why I really enjoy those flourishes is just because I've always gotten really great joy out of them. Even when I was a listener, teenager, and I didn't know anything about the technology, there were certain albums and certain songs that I found especially interesting. And now I know that it was due to a lot of these flourishes. And now I know terms like, repeated listenability and things like that, which, if you have a really great flat mix that just sounds like a live performance, some people might love it, but I personally feel like the probability of people wanting to listen to it over and over and over again on repeat is much lower. But if you've got a lot of interesting things coming in and out and flowing, and the listener is constantly surprised by all these changes, then I personally find myself being like, oh man, like I want to go back and hear that again. So that's another thing that I try and bring into my mixes as much as possible. So anyway, that's enough of me talking. Let's jump into this song. The band is called Waif. The song I'm going to be running through with you guys is called Silt. And I'm just going to go through my approach from start to finish. I think people usually at this point end up playing the final mix, but I don't think that's really fair because I don't get to hear the final mix at this stage. I have to make the final mix. So I'm going to play you guys the rough that I was sent, and then I'm going to play you the files as they were, all at 0. And then we'll build it up from the ground up. So here is the rough, halfway silt. That's the song we'll be working on today. I always start by listening to the rough and the references. In this case, there weren't any references sent along. There's usually, I jump into mix prep, and that's something that we'll skip over, and I'll just kind of give you a basic rundown of what I do. But why I like to listen to it first is because whether I realize it or not, my brain is already kind of solving the problem. You know, I've already heard, you know, what's going on here, and I've kind of mentally taken note of a lot of the effects that they used, a lot of the problems that need to be resolved. We'll get more into that later. As far as mix prep goes, I personally don't like to start on anything creative until mix prep is done. The reason for this is, I mean, everybody has a different idea of what mix ready is, but mine is pretty specific. And back in my assistant years, I had the pleasure of assisting some top mixers, and sometimes I would spend hours, sometimes days, doing mix prep for these mixers. And in my ignorance, I thought, like, you know, what a waste of time, you know, like cleaning all this stuff up. I mean, it's all visual and none of it makes a difference and blah, blah, blah. But now I know that having a really clearly labeled, organized session, it's really important for me to deliver consistent results repeatedly. And in the end, it ends up saving a ton of time as well. And so it's something that kind of pays for itself. An example would be, you can see that I've dropped markers to lay out the entire arrangement. That's something that, you know, in real time would have taken me, you know, 4 minutes to go through the song and do it. But now, at any point, if I'm like, oh, I want to work on verse 2, then there's verse 2. If I want to work on chorus 2, it's like, there's chorus 2. I don't have to be like constantly grabbing my mouse and like, do I use the grid? Do I not use the... It's just, it's all set up and it's ready to go. And this also really helps because you can use those markers and their commands along with the shift function as well. And so when I'm going in and I'm doing automation, I can also be like, oh, you know, I want to boost the chorus, and I can just select the chorus and go up to, you know, whatever it is I want to automate, and there's my perfect chunk right there. And it saves a ton of time for me. The other thing that is really important to me with mix prep is just general organization, knowing where everything is and it being in an order that to me makes sense. And so I've got, you know, all my drums in one place. I've got, you know, if I had, this song in particular doesn't have live drums, but if I had live drums, they'd be separated but nearby. Bass is all in one place. You get the idea. And I also take this opportunity to start making buses for everything, labeling things, grouping things, and this is where things for me get a little bit nutty, and that's because I personally really like to have separate sets of send returns for each one of my groups. And what I mean by this is that if I set up a reverb for my drums, there's going to be a send coming from my drums and returning to an all drums group, and there's nothing else that's going to be sent to that drum reverb. It's got to be something within that drum group. And if for some reason, let's say I love that reverb sound and I want continuity and I want that same reverb sound to be on guitars, I will duplicate that track and I will reroute it to the guitar bus so that everything is separated. And again, no rules. This is just how I prefer working. It's something that I developed out of necessity. And that necessity doesn't really come until later, until I feel like a mix is like 95% there. And I found this problem when I was mixing on consoles. You know, obviously, it wasn't really possible to have 30 reverbs running when you're mixing analog. And I would get a mix really, really close, but I'd find myself like, oh man, like I really want to carve out this frequency buildup. Drums are a great example. Let's say, the snare is ringing out at like 200 hertz through one of the reverbs. Like, oh, I really want to carve that out. And so I go try and carve it out of the snare because I didn't want to pull it out of the reverb that, all these other things were going to. But then the snare would get thin, and I'd be like, oh, I don't really want to pull it out of the direct signal. I want to just pull it out of the reverb. And so then you get into, muting things and printing things and running things back in. And you can run into the same issues in the box. The difference is that there's nothing holding you back from having dedicated effects except the couple seconds that it takes to create it and a little bit of extra processing power. So it's something that I've started doing on all of my mixes all of the time. There's also, when you're getting into automation stuff at the very end, there's also a lot of times that those flourishes I was telling you about, sometimes they require automating these effects, automating feedback on a delay, automating, some sort of EQ at the tail end of an effects chain. And if you've got a bunch of stuff running through it, then you have this idea, and you have to drop everything and duplicate the track and reroute everything, and then you're like, oh man, did I forget something? Like the mix sounds kind of different, and by that time you're like pulled out of this idea that you had. But if everything is already routed in this way, that it makes me feel free, like I can do anything I want to any individual part of the song without the entire mix crumbling to the ground. Let's just run through and look at some of the effects that I set up, because one of the first things when I've begun with all these groups, there are some basic effects that I use on pretty much every session. One of those is Valhalla Reverb. I use it a lot. I feel like it's particularly their chambers. It's a really great reverb for just kind of subtly giving things depth, subtly widening things. But when you don't want to call attention, like hey, I'm really trying to showcase this reverb. H reverb, kind of the opposite when I am trying to showcase a reverb. Echo Boy. In the rough, there were quite a bit of drum delays going, and this project was done in Ableton, so the files that I have are all completely dry, and so I knew I was going to have to recreate a lot of those drum delays. Immediately went for Echo Boy. It's one of my favorites. You'll see a lot of Soundtoys plugins as we're going, but Echo Boy is probably one of the ones I use the most, particularly Space Echo. One of the great things about, I love actual space echoes as well when I have access to them, but this plugin is really fantastic, and one of the great things about it is the way it modulates. It's trying to model a lot of these old tape delays that the rollers had been worn down, and so they weren't perfectly round, and so you'd get kind of this push and this pull, and with the delay it would create a frequency modulation. And a lot of delays have this built into them, but Soundtoys is, to me, the most musical one, the most interesting one, and the one that I can dial in the most in this style edit section, which I use very, very heavily. So as you can see, I've got all these buses set up, and then I have this all group. And so if at any point I wanted to mute all of my drums, all of my drum effects, or trim all of my drums, all of my drum effects, it would all just be right there, super simple. And then I've got my bass. I've got microshift, which I find myself using on synth bass a lot, another Soundtoys plugin. And then on my synth bus that I've created, I've got Crystallizer, which again is another one that I just think it sounds incredible, particularly on synths and drums. There really isn't anything quite like it. I use it very, very heavily. And then also microshift on the vocals. This is a whole nother, again, set of buses. And another Echo Boy. another H reverb, and then 4 more echo boys you can see here. So let's, now that we've kind of got through what would be like the mix prep stage, that, you know, this would probably usually take me a little while, but we'll just jump right into listening to what the actual files sound like as we have them. It's really common to get a ref or a rough that, regardless of the state it's in, sounds nothing like the files that you have. Sometimes that's that the rough was done during a different time period and some stuff has been done to the song. Sometimes it was that the engineer just like really wanted to go the extra mile and spent a day on the rough, like mixing it on a console and trying to nail it. You never know, but this is when I start like really looking into what we have to work with. So these are the files, completely dry. I think it's also probably worth mentioning that that rough didn't have final vocals on it, but it was still very important for us to listen to it so that we had reference for the effects that you'll hear dry now, that without those drum effects, without vocal effects, it's a very different composition. So this is just faders at 0, and we'll go from there. So that's enough for us to get started, not just for this talk, but I also get impatient when I'm going through this process, and I'm like, okay, I have plenty of ideas from that. And so listening through, I just kind of jump into what my first instincts are. I feel like a lot of times I was taught that you kind of had to pick one, like, oh, you got to either start with your drums, or you got to start with your vocals, or you got to start by EQing, but don't compress things yet. You got to this. And coming back to the no rules thing, I don't do any of that. I feel like based on the arrangement, I kind of just start from the top. And so in this case, we've got this synth that goes through all of the verses. And I'll just kind of be like, all right, well, like, what do I need to work on with this synth? So in this case, I started with an EQ, and I was just like, okay, like let's pull a ton of the low mids out, and let's really boost up around 3K. I'm using BX Digital, which you'll see I use the V2 EQ very, very heavily. Not just on this session, on all of my sessions. It's kind of my go-to surgical compression, surgical EQ. I'm a very, very big fan of it. So I EQ'd it, and then put a little bit of Phoenix on it, which is super, super subtle. And then I really like the filters on Pro Q. And then that's just my basic chamber that I was telling you about that I use on everything. And you can hear it's pretty subtle. And then this delay is actually the crystallizer that I was talking about. And as you can see, that's all I did to that sound. And there's nothing going on for those first, for that first little bit until right around here where the vocals come in. So this is usually where I kind of stop myself from, I always kind of want to jump into the vocals, but it's like a little bit premature. So what's the next thing that I can work on? Let's work on this loop. So the first thing is I was like, oh, that just like needs to be way louder. But turning it up didn't really do for it what I was looking for. You know, I really wanted to bring it forward. And there's so many weird, like, high-frequency things in that loop. Find myself working with loops a lot, and it creates a lot of challenges because you don't have all these individual things that, you know, if this was all tracked out, and I had, you know, those 3 or 4 different sounds all individually on different tracks, then I may have used, you know, a series of different EQs and compressors with different settings on each one. But because it's a loop, I had to find something that would kind of glue everything together and kind of add like that texture that I was talking about before, how I know that it's going to be the bed through, you can see pretty much the entire track. And so I put trash on it, which is another one of my favorites. And then let's see what this trim is doing. That I'm already automating, so I think it might have been that one of those hits wasn't really centered, if I remember right. Oh, it must have been turned off. But that is something that I do mess with loops a lot, is sometimes you'll get a loop, and let's say that, you know, the background of the loop is stereo, and it's fairly balanced from left to right, but then you've got like this hit that happens like hard right in a way that you wish it was center. The easiest way that I've found that I like to resolve that is using the trim tool. I'll just go to whichever side needs to be turned up or turned down, and I'll automate it. This early in the stage, I will run through and I'll automate them all. It's usually a fairly quick job. Sometimes it's not, but it ends up being worth it. Just because it's a loop, I don't find it a handicap. I refuse to. Like if I have a vision of the way I want something to be, I refuse to be like, oh, well, like I could do this, but it'll take too much time. Once I have the idea of like, oh, that hit needs to be center, then I'm going to find a way to make it center. So that's what that trash is doing. It's really hard to tell because of the level jump, but it's bringing a lot of the texture and a lot of the top end out of it. And then I would probably pull up these drums a little bit, see what's going on here. So again, sound toys, again, texture, radiator. I put radiator on all of those. Similar settings, but tweaked a little bit. And then again, BX, pulling lows, boosting highs, really common. R comp, really basic, does the trick, nothing special. And then let's see, this is just trimming. It's not doing anything from left to right. And this would be when I would probably go back and be like, okay, like what do we have happening here in the rough that is not happening? Okay, so we've got that delay. And then I'd want to see maybe like, okay, where else is this happening? Happening here. Got the delay there as well. So I think what I did was I dialed in the delay. But I think I ended up automating it. Let's see if it's, or if I have it from the top. I guess I've got it running from the top. So I think I opted for faster. You know, I did a triplet on this one, and I decided to save that kind of bouncy quarter note stuff for later in the song. So we'll come back to that. So now what we've got is loop, drums, and then these are some samples that got filtered. Let's see what those sound like. Mag EQ is another one of my favorites. That airband, it's just simple, easy. I like how it sounds. It's just some vocal samples. Let's see what they. So this is them before. You know, obviously like pretty quiet and muffled, and you know, that filter really helps things. And then again, hybrid, I weigh really really heavily on it, and then mag. Let's mute the vocals. On solo. So now I would probably just jump into these vocals and see what we've got. So this is completely dry vocals. I absolutely love Nandi's voice. From the first time I heard the demos on this project, I got really, really excited about her voice. And so I really wanted to showcase her voice on every single song. And this was the first song on the album that I mixed, so I really wanted to focus heavily on that. I feel like she has an incredible amount of emotion in her voice, you know, tapping back into what I was saying about emotion being a high priority of mine. You know, one of the most important ones is obviously the emotion in the singer's voice. And so I remember that in the rough, it was fairly wet throughout, and I had this idea that I would maybe have it like medium wet in the verses and then pretty dry in the choruses, and that would create kind of a shift. So let's start with my vocal chain, which is fairly different on every project. Didn't really need to do much on this one. Again, hybrid. I put a de-esser at the beginning of the chain always. I usually leave it disabled in the beginning and decide whether I think it's necessary, but realistically, it always ends up getting turned on. But in the rare cases where I'm like, these S's are fine, or, you know, potentially over de-essing, then obviously I would just disable it. Again, R-comp, believe it or not, really simple, does what you ask it to.
That loves me, but
All super subtle stuff.
leaves
Just pulling out a little bit.
like I'm alive.
More Phoenix, a little bit of Phoenix everywhere.
I'll bite your head off if you let
More mag.
me.
Little bit of limiting. And that's just how good she sounds. You know, I'm not really doing that much there. You know, it's a good mic, great singer, great performance, and you know, that's kind of, as a mixer, just like a windfall. You know, like when you get a great performer, a lot of times it's just kind of like getting out of the way of how good it is on its own. There's a little bit rolling off on this bus, which I think I have automated. We will get into what that automation is later. A little bit of micro shift. I came up in vintage analog studios, so I used the AMS DMX a lot for this. Sometimes the Eventide H3000. But as far as the plugin domain, I really don't think that anything does it like microshift. It's something that I use on every single session. Again, it's subtle, particularly to the audience with this kind of setup. But if you put headphones on, it does create a sense of width that is difficult to do with other groups of plugins, and very easy to do with a little bit of micro pitch. What else do I have going on in this section? I'm going to leave this last one disabled because that was much later in the mix that I put that one on. Okay, so again, that chamber, you know, big fan of it. Not a super long tail. And then I've got kind of a room sound going.
I'll bite your head off if you
Again, those are already automated. We'll get into where those pop in later. A little bit of plate. Plate's turned down pretty low, but it's long. If you listen, there's the two layers. There's this much shorter. And again, I would actually be doing this early on because the vocal is so naked in the earlier part of the song. If I was working on a mix and the entire song, it was really dense and the vocal was never by itself, then I would recommend avoiding this, because by the time you've mixed the rest of the song, these decisions you've made are not going to be audible. But because there's very, very little going on, I mean, it's her voice and that synth and that little bit. It makes sense to get a vocal sound early enough and build the rest of the track around that vocal sound, because it needs to command the attention. It's the first, let's see, about 45 seconds of the song are like that. And so it's really important that vocal sound, it commands that the listener keep listening, you know, that they're on the edge of their seat waiting for, like, oh, well, what's going to come next? That echo is automated all the way down, so we'll ignore that, and we'll come back to that automation later. And so far, this is what we've got. Again, I would regularly go back to the rough and make sure we're not working backwards. Like, okay, great. More clarity, more emotion, love it. Let's move on. So how does it sit with the drums?
If you let me.
It works. And then we've got a new part coming in. This is what I mean by how I really like to work stream of consciousness is when something comes in the arrangement, I like to dial it in. If I try and look at the whole thing all at one time and I'm like, oh, like, how am I going to make the drums work for the whole song? Then I get kind of overwhelmed and it doesn't really work with my process. But going in this method feels really organic to me. Let's also mute this background. So now we've got a synth bass. Exciting. Again, hybrid. Pulling out those low mids, I mean, that's really, I would say 90% of the projects, it's like half the day is dialing in those low mids. And as far as my process of knowing what to dial in and why, it's kind of too long for this talk, but I would just say trusting your ears and really messing around with bandwidth and sweeping frequencies, which is something that is very, very easily done with the Brainworks plugin. Again, R-comp, love it. And then I've got, wanted to create a little bit of width in this sound. So I've got this real ADT running with a preset that I've made. A lot of these things I'll create presets and I'll save them and I'll be like, oh, like I think that sound that I got like 6 months ago is like halfway in the direction of what I'm going for, and so I'll pull in that preset and then I'll dial it in like a little bit further so that it's like curated for that particular song. And then, again, filter. Part of what I was saying about detail is if you really want all the stuff in the top end to stand out, then everything can't have top end. So, like, does that bass really need that growl in this particular song? And my judgment call was no, that it didn't. So I did that filter. A little bit of trim, balancing what was going on with the ADT. A little bit more width out of another micro pitch. And then a little bit of ultra reverb, which is another plugin I'm a big fan of.
Me, I get lonely, I get angry.
So a lot of those kind of stereo plugins just kind of help create depth. You know, your bass is often going to be, whether they're synths or, you know, any of the low-end material is usually going to end up sent up the middle, and your lead vocal is usually going to get sent up the middle. And finding a way to create a little bit of depth will make some space for the vocal. And so if you listen, it like kind of stepped on things for me a little bit. And that width kind of helped more create like a bed or you know, like a cloud for her to kind of drift on or something. And then happens later in the song. We'll get to that later. Let's pull up this. Got this great harmony here. This went through a very similar chain, but ended up getting committed. But you can just take my word for it that it's a very similar chain. Subtly different EQ. obviously that's like really hyping the lead vocal in like the 6.3K area. Depending on the vocal, you might like sweep around to try and find what the most musical frequency is, but it's trying to bring out some of the breath, some of the intelligibility of the voice. If you do that to all of your background vocals, then it ends up creating a lot of that build-up that I was talking about, where it's just kind of too much going on. It was very similar settings on things, a little bit less compression, a little bit less boost in the top end, a little bit of panning.
Deserves me. I get lonely.
And going through that same bus, exact same effects.
Angry. My love is like an island. You can't find it if you're not trying. If you want my love, I will guide you.
All right,
I will.
so now we get to the hard part, transitions. Dialing in sounds, as time goes on, it just kind of becomes, I don't know, like you're solving a math problem, and almost like you become automated, where you just start doing whatever it needs. But when it comes to transitions, I feel like that's where the human element really comes in, and I feel like a lot of times if you get, some top mixer, a lot of times big projects have multiple top mixers mix a project, and they pick one. So they may have like Manny American mix the single, but they'll also have Spike Stent and Serban mix the single, and they'll compare them. And a lot of times there's a huge amount of similarities. There are definitely not similarities in the transitions. The way things feel and the way they change, I feel like it's the human element of a mixer really comes in there. And so, as you can see, everything changes. There's nothing in the arrangement that is in that previous section that is in that next section. So it's almost like we're starting a mix from scratch to some extent. And this kind of works well with what I was saying about wanting there to be an emotional shift there. So let's start with these synths here. All right. It's cool. Got some out of time delays going. Again, radiator, love it. Bringing out texture. Naturally kind of compressing it, saturating it. This delay is, again, width, just like a little bit of delay on one side. That's something you have to be really, really careful of because of phase. Again, that's a long conversation, but if you're going to start delaying things and panning them, it's something that in the old days they definitely would have said that you're breaking the rules, you can't do that. But if you're doing it to something to create width and you're regularly referencing mono and you're okay with the way it folds down, then again, there are no rules. I liked how it sounded. Again, Mag EQ. A little bit of hall. A little bit of chamber. Let's see what its neighbor sounds like. Similar, but muffly. I left this one mono, and I left it a little bit darker. And I just kind of, blended the two to try and fill it out. And then I love that sound. Again, windfall, that's just the file, Sometimes you get files and, I could spend, I could get a file that sounds nothing like that, but envision that it could be that, and it could take a half an hour out of my day trying to like turn it into that sound. But I remember sitting down and pulling up the sound and just being like, great, you know, very little I need to do there. So again, didn't feel like it needed to be quite that bright, needed some EQ. And then again, width from that delay. What else do we have in this first half of chorus 1? We've got some bass stuff. We have a new pad. This also brings me to another topic of judgment calls, something that you have to be really, really careful with. There are these two pads that run through both of the full choruses, and one of them is kind of growlier. Let's listen to what I did to it. Wanted to bring out that growl even more. And then this one, which is a bit mellower. And I just kind of thought, like, right off the bat, before even unmuting that vocal, I remember thinking, like, if it's running through that whole section, then, like, what's going to be there to support this beat drop? And so I tried muting the growlier one in the first half, which again, I knew these clients really well. I had a great idea of what they were going for, and I was also co-producing on this project. And so that allowed me to feel like I had the right to make a judgment call like this. There's definitely projects where I have an idea like that, and I will not do it without running it by the client. And that's something to be really careful of. Early in my career, I got in trouble a couple times, people being like a little bit offended, where they're like, we like it, but you know your place kind of thing. So just a little warning there. I wish someone would have warned me of that, but it's better safe than sorry, in my opinion. There have been quite a few spec mixes that I've gotten that the other mix was great, but the client was like, it's kind of more of a remix. You know, it hasn't been mixed yet, so like I don't know why they changed all these things about my song. So just something to be aware of. This bass sound, again, pretty straightforward. Radiator, R comp, nothing crazy here. More micro shift, more hall. And then let's dial in this new vocal sound. So
if you want my love, I will guide you.
Had like a little left, center, right thing going because we had 3 vocals. Very, very similar chain, but with subtly different settings, little bit more limiting, little bit different EQ. When you send things to reverbs, it inherently changes the tone of it. You know, you're not just blending the EQ that you've done, but you're also blending it with whatever the sonic characteristics are of the effects chains that you've sent it to. And so this particular set of EQ worked with those reverbs, but with this drier vocal, it ended up being you know, a little bit of a different chain. They got me happy with it.
Love, I will guide. If you want my love, I will guide you. I will
So that's the
be your
drier.
anchor. If I only had a minute
That's
to
all 3.
myself, then I would let you in without poison.
And this is what they sound like all together.
If you want my love, I will guide you. I will be your anchor. If I only had a minute to myself, then.
So the point of that section being mellower and me muting that other bass is to kind of catch everybody off guard and create even more suspense. Because I remember the first time I heard this song, I definitely wasn't expecting this beat to drop in the way that it does. Let's now get to the beat. Again, it's a loop, so my preset in trash, really bringing it forward, and obviously distorting it quite a bit, making it brighter. And then just a little bit of that chamber. Again, we have an automated delay that comes on later. And then there's that cool thing, trash again. And this, I think, was another panning. Yeah, it's just, right side needed an extra dB to get it panned where I wanted it, in conjunction with the way it's panned there. So now let's see from that section.
If you want my love, I will guide you. I will be your anchor. If I only had a minute to myself, then I would let you in without poison. I would eat my anger if you only gave.
Okay, so immediately I'm just like, oh man, that's also a cool sound. How can we spice it up? How can we make it interesting? How can we make it more emotional? I believe I turned to Sound Toys. Echo Boy. Again, just like tweaked it, played with it, found this sound. Again, I really recommend any time that you have free time, maybe not when you have a client sitting over your shoulder, but anytime that you have free time, like getting in these plugins deep, because anybody can pull up one of these plugins and pull up a preset, but when you really start dialing in the tweak settings, the style edit settings, when you start automating things, not only do you learn a lot about the characteristics of the plugin, what it sounds like when you distort it, what it sounds like when you EQ it, but you also start developing your own sounds that you can kind of claim as your own, and it can kind of differentiate you from, there are a lot of great mixes out there that, to me sound like a little bit prepackaged. And it doesn't mean that the mixer wasn't incredible. It just, you can tell that it was like, oh, RMX preset, Bricasti preset, Echo Boy preset, and that is a way to work, and a lot of guys are successful working in that way. But I really like the idea of curating sounds for each and every project. And so this particular sound, it's just a ping pong, again, with a lot of that frequency modulation. And frequency modulation can, a lot of times, make things sound more emotional to me, kind of like a great violinist or something. But you also have to be careful of that, because it can also make things sound kind of drunk or cartoony. So this is without the Echo Boy, and with it. And so you can see it's just kind of a warbly tail, because it's such a short delay. It almost sounds like a reverb when you hear it in the mix. Moving on. Oh, wow, look at the time. Better really move on here. So let's just start taking some of the things that are less exciting and just kind of undo all this disabled plugin stuff. And then I can talk more about some of the automation that helped out massaging some of these transitions. And maybe a little bit about one of the major reverb throws in one of those transitions, which is something that I enjoy the most about mixing. So, oops, let's see where we are now. Okay. It's okay, you got a general idea of the fact. You can see it's like a lot of the same plugins here, and really honestly, Sound Toys and BX are probably the only ones that are really consistently on absolutely every single session that I do. The rest, I kind of just, no offense, but just like get tired of looking at some plugin and I pull up another one, And it's not like hardware where overnight I'm like, oh man, that's the record that I was using that plugin, and you can really hear the difference. It's like a lot of them sound really, really alike. And for me, Sound Toys really, really stands apart. And that BX, I think, is one of maybe 3 really clean plugins that will do what I use it for, and it just happens to be my favorite one. Also look at my 2-bus, which you'll see when I play back the final mix is not really doing that much. I don't like to weigh heavily on the 2-bus because I feel like it can be kind of a crutch, and it removes flexibility. If you do this mix that if you turn the 2-bus off, everything falls apart, then sometimes, a client will give a really simple note like, can I get one that's less compressed? And you're like, oh no, my whole mix is based on all of that compression. Because, if you have a bad balance and you squash it hard enough, that compressor will balance things. And so I try to be really careful to not get too heavy-handed. Sorry for the wait with all of that. Let's do a quick, because of time, a quick listen to the final, and then I'll just walk over some of the automation really fast. Or better yet, there you go.
I live to keep it down. I get salt in my mouth. And there's no reason not to grow. Nobody's stopping me now. I got here on my own. If you want my love, I will guide you. I will be your anchor. If I only had a minute to myself, then I would let you in without poison. I would eat my anger if you only gave me what I wanted. If you want my love, I will guide you. I will be your anchor. If I only had a minute to myself, then I would let you in without poison. I would eat my anger if you only gave me what I wanted. I will guide you. I will guide you. I will guide you.
Thanks. So that's the unmastered final. I feel like we're out of time, but I'm really quickly just going to show just a little bit of the automation that's coming on and off, particularly this change right here.
I got here on my own. If you want my love, I will guide you. I will.
That vocal, was just a held vocal, and it didn't feel particularly dramatic to me. So I took this throw that's sending to these three echo boys. They all have the same input, and they're long, and they're all sending to reverbs, and those reverbs are all sending to reverbs, and they're all EQ'd. And when you solo it,
I got here on my own.
and then it just kind of goes on, and I don't think it gets cut until this second part of chorus 2. And stuff like that requires quite a bit of massaging, there's, that's my room getting ramped up, that's my hall, that's my plate, that's another echo boy, and then those are the throws. And then you'll also see it didn't really feel like it was drifting away in the way that I wanted it to, and so I also added this filter sweep here. It kind of just like grabs the tail a little bit, and I don't think any of those are automated. Maybe that one's just left dark. And I try and leave time to do that kind of stuff on every song, Sometimes I'm not great at time management, which, can see by me running out of time here. But fortunately for me, that just means working insane hours. It doesn't mean that I have to walk away. And so it's often why I find myself in the studio at 4 in the morning, is because I just want to do that one last thing. But I guess we're probably out of time, but I will make myself available for any questions. I was going to try and leave some time for Q&A up here, but things just didn't go that way. So I'm sorry about that, but I will be around to answer anything you guys may have.
Thank you so much to David Tolomei. Thanks also, round of applause for Sound Toys for sponsoring this so we can give it to you all for free.